Well, you know, the first encounter was a very fleeting one. It was in 1964. He had come into Dar es Salaam, and we had finished our military training in Moscow, which had lasted for almost a year, 11 months and 2 weeks. And we're back in readiness to go to transfer to a military camp in Kongwa in central Tanzania. He came on an inspection visit in the camp, and I remember we just formed an ad hoc line, you know. There were just about 8 of us and so on, but to receive him, we were asked to set up a formation. Being taller than most people, I was at the beginning of the line. And when he came close to me, he said, "Wow, I'm under a tree here. This is good protection. This is not much else."
So what do you believe influenced his leadership, influenced him to be a transformational leader and to be open to this kind of evolution?
Well, I don't know whether they are, in fact, born leaders, but if you allow that expression, I would say he really was a born leader. In terms of what you are saying about his speech in 1990, was it?
Yes,
when he arrived in South Africa. What must be remembered was that up to that point, or shortly before they arrived back in here, Umkhonto weSizwe, under the leadership of the African National Congress, had been involved in an armed struggle. It was clear that there were possibilities of achieving what had been sought through negotiations. So what he's talking about here is change the attitudes, change the thinking of the followership, and get everybody to be ready to embark now on negotiations and be very well prepared for them. Because having agreed to talk, the enemy, that's what they were, at least the apartheid regime, would need to be told what our own view of the content of negotiation was going to be. So he's then saying the arms are down and there is a task ahead. Change your mindset and be ready and be in a position to be as prepared as you would ever be to enter into the new phase. And in that regard, I remember that a number of commissions were set up, commissions on education, on defense, on a number of things. So this is what was going to be put on the table in the new phase of the struggle. This is why we put down our arms. These are going to be our demands going forward for freedom. So that's the kind of person he would be. I guess everybody would know that when they enter a new phase, they have to prepare. But he was extremely thorough about that. The number of people had been appointed already before arrival in South Africa, heading up particular commissions, you know, as I was saying, on health, on education, and the number of vital issues that would be on the table as to what the ANC would expect a health department to look like, you know, primary health care, hospitals, what was the main thing. And people came in really quite prepared.
And it's extraordinary that you say that. I want to just ask you, you know, something in response to what you said. So he has to convince a party that has been involved in an armed struggle to lay down their arms and begin negotiating. Now, of course, from this lens, know how the story goes. I know that in 1994, there are elections. But at the time, that was not necessarily guaranteed. How did he convince people, you know, soldiers such as yourself, that this was the way to go? And how did he deal with so-called resistance from some, or skepticism from some within his own party?
It was actually quite a difficult transition. There had been talks prior to the agreement that people can come back to South Africa. There had been discussions between business people representing the interests of South Africa, white South Africa, and with the approval of the apartheid regime. And there had been a pretty good idea that everybody is in agreement that the situation couldn't continue as it was. It was not viable. Oh my God.
Yes, Baba Mavuso, we can hear you.
Oh, I see. It cut me off, and so on. I'm very sorry about that. I hope you'll be able to manage this. Yeah. So there was a clear. So you are asking what it required for people to transform and live what they've been doing traditionally for very many years.
Yes.
And accept a new phase in their lives. Yes, I remember that Chris Hani, one of the most respected, perhaps the most respected among us, for his preparedness to be involved in the struggle, come into South Africa and fight and all of that. There is a video clip that tends to do the rounds in which he says, I am not happy with this. Some of us were not consulted. He didn't say I wasn't as a person. We were not consulted in some of these things, but as a disciplined member of the African National Congress, I will accept this new situation. But for most of the part, people were prepared to accept that a decision had been taken and there was readiness. If anything had gone wrong, I have no doubt that there would have been a place to find a way of people defending themselves. But by and large, the confidence in a position that was taken by Tambo, mind you, at the time, this man is already unwell in terms of physically. He had suffered a stroke. That was a very, very serious imposition, but that never dented his credibility, the respect that people held for him. It didn't affect his mental faculties. But here was Tambo saying, we have arrived at a situation where we feel comfortable that we can put our demands across without having to kill people any further. So this was, by and large, to a very, very large extent, accepted by the members. Need to say that he was a very democratic leader, highly consultative. So there wouldn't be a question of his thinking alone there and suddenly he says, this is what we're going to do tomorrow. I've heard people making comments about, the ANC is used to military kinds of discipline and so on. Never was that the case with the African National Congress side of the leadership. You must remember, there was the ANC, and under the ANC, under a completely different regimen, but under the ANC was Umkhonto weSizwe. There, of course, we are dealing with a military situation where people must accept orders. But on the political side, it was Tambo's style. Absolutely, his inner being revolved around him being able to get the views of other people, debate things, and add up with a consensus position so that by the time you move forward, you know that you're all moving in unison.
And it's wonderful that you say that, and you're not the first among, historians to call his leadership very democratic, to say that, OR was democratic in his decision-making. Now we know from written history and from practice that the organization he led believed in democratic centralism. So how did he balance that mandate as the leader and that he, at the end of the day, was accountable for decisions with also this democratic nature of his leadership?
Discussions would take place and there would be enough time for a particular topic or subject to be canvassed as broadly as possible. So the lower structures would have their discussions in the camps, in offices, wherever ANC units who always met as branches in exile to discuss issues. So when it came to implementation, the democratic centralism provides for a decision that's being made by the senior position, senior echelon, being accepted as the position of the organization. So it's very much in line with what we're discussing. By the time the decision was taken in issues of policy and strategy, politically, many people would have had the first bite of this matter, and they're not taken by surprise. They understand which way we're going, and there was a lot of political discussions, by the way, even at the informal level. Things were not hidden. That's again his style, and it became the style of the ANC. I do want to say that he influenced very many people. I think he would be a little disappointed if we singled him out as the thing without which nothing would happen. Yes, I mean, we admit that it was would not have been easy to find a leader to rival him, but the essence of his leadership was that we are a collective, we discuss, we agree, we let everybody understand and agree where we're going, and as much as possible, and one needs to say as much as possible, by the time a decision is taken by the National Executive Committee, it is pretty well understood by everybody.
Just on this question, how was he? Was he a gifted consensus builder? Because you notice that before he left the country, he was a lawyer, one of the first Black lawyers in the country. Him and Mandela, of course, had a firm, and he's quite a prolific intellectual. So how did he manage to communicate in a way that he was able to connect and relate to everyone, seeing that his intellectual stature was, a bit different?
Well, he was an outstanding communicator. I just don't know that I've come across a better communicator than him. It didn't matter whether he was addressing a meeting, small meeting, addressing the crowds in exile that would have been several hundred people, whether he was addressing the AU, which was then called the Organization of African Unity, OAU. He was just an outstanding communicator, both as a deliverer of a speech, but also a communicator of ideas. You almost didn't want to see him reading what he had written, what he had prepared, and he always did that. This ability, the eloquence, the astuteness to communicate a message, and it was understood by many. I think it helped him to have been a good lawyer. I think in his practice with Nelson Mandela, I can't remember what they say in their book, but he was the one interrogating cases, interviewing people, and leading the subjects, so the subject. So he was, and that was in line. I mean, he was a gifted communicator. He was very broad in his thinking. I mean, really, really broad in his thinking. And that just got accepted by everybody, admired. There was no question of not being understood. Yeah.
Were they structures of accountability, checks and balances in the organization as it went into exile? You speak of the many committees established and the many sessions of consultation when making decisions, but in terms of, for example, running the camps, delegating finances when receiving them. How did he make sure that the institution, though it was a liberation movement, remained ethical and practiced good governance, even in its difficult circumstances?
Well, you know, this is a challenge. It is the norm, by the way, that an organization that is serious and committed to liberation should act in an ethical manner. I have to say that if you compare that with what's happening now, ethics in terms of personal behavior, the morality of the individuals who are placed in particular positions throughout the organization, there is a careful selection of those kinds of people. There are no temptations. I'm not saying it was easy for them, but you know, when you look at what we have, we are in government now, we have a lot of power, and we have the power to to do people some favors if we're not very careful. But people come to you and plead with you to do certain things, and if you are not made of the fiber that some of the older people, older members of the organization were made of, you're likely to fall into temptation. I think we will discuss that as we come forward, but you talk about the Umkhonto weSizwe. The set of organization was completely different there. People are in the camps by and large, and the program is very clear, planning to go back home. Tambo, on the other hand, you know, he's straddling an ANC that is focused on taking people back home to start recruiting people, training them, and then starting a liberation war. And you have a mission that is established abroad in line with the decision that I referred to that had been taken by the National Executive in 1958. So before you knew, thanks again to Tambo's ability to work with common people, people at the grassroots, you have the anti-apartheid movement mushrooming and sprouting all over the world. I mean, literally that, in Europe, in several countries there, in Australia, you had in the United States, all of these people saying, we support what the African National Congress is planning to do. We support the struggle for liberation in South Africa. Tambo is the person who, I'll give you a little anecdote. I think this has been talked about. When Chief Luthuli is then killed by a train in 1967, we no longer have a president except Tambo acting in that capacity in exile. And, you know, we say, Chief, whenever we go on delegations and talk to heads of states and other leading people, whether it's the United Nations, the AU, and so on, you're always introduced as acting president of the ANC. Perhaps we should just agree that it's more convenient for you to be referred to as president of the ANC. Vintage Tambo says, you know, presidents of the ANC tend to be elected at conferences, and there is no way that people in exile can constitute themselves to form a conference that would be able to elect a leader. So I will stay as acting president. They'll have to learn to live with the inconvenience of dealing with the acting and know that I carry the substance and the authority and the mandate of the African National Congress. That's the man. It took a communication from Robben Island after Chief Luthuli had died to convince him that, wait a minute, we think it would be more appropriate that you accept the position of president of the ANC. We think that's how it should be. Then, and only then, did he accept that position. And he said, as soon as conditions permit the election of a president by the masses at home, I will step down from this position and allow for a proper president to be elected.
some of the diversity that existed within his own party. That within the ANC, which was different from many other liberation organizations on the continent, such as ZANU-PF, Frelimo, UDPS, etc., the ANC within it had white people and had an alliance with the South African Communist Party. And even with the Africans who were part of the ANC, many of them came from different backgrounds. You know, the 1970s, after the 1976 Soweto uprising, saw a lot of young people influenced by Black consciousness philosophy, for example, coming into the organization. How was he able to keep unity and keep a single-mindedness within the organization when there was such a diverse group of people within it, and also diverse interests?
Yeah, well, I need to say that the crucial point of challenge, tension, was not so much white comrades within the organization. These were not challenges. Once it became clear that the ANC had to prepare people to learn how to fight, to learn how to wage a military struggle, then it was very clear that the accent of the struggle had changed. So you had young people mostly going to receive training, being exposed to a very large extent, and most of the people who were trained by the ANC went to the Soviet Union. And the politics there was the politics of socialism. It's a credit to the ANC that although socialism was the ideology of the people who were assisting the ANC never changed from its charter of just being a liberation movement, a movement to free African people. We were never called a social, although the thinking among most of us was that socialism would be the way to go. After all, you know, we saw what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time. Talking about myself, that's where I trained. I mean, you saw some amazing things. So the thinking really was very socialistic. I don't know what the other right word is, but egalitarian. So that really was the thinking. The issue of race was raised by a few people. They ended up being called the Gang of Eight. When the Morogoro Conference was held in 1969, it was because there had been very slow progress within the ANC in terms of going back home. We had trained, I had finished my training in 1964. The others who had subsequently gone to training. But by 1966, we were all, itching to go home. And we were not, because it was that difficult to go across. So that was the issue. There are people who try to capitalize on those difficulties, or shall I? Let me restate this. So people said, you are not going home. People are beginning to desert the camps and go to other places. In the meantime, those in MK were saying, wow, we're sitting here and the leaders out in the towns, in Dar es Salaam, Lusaka, or wherever it was, keep getting into aeroplanes, going to conferences. These are the contradictions that Tambo needed to manage as a leader. The conference in Morogoro happened because people had gone already. You've heard of the Wonky Operation Comeback, and things seemed to fizzle out after 1968 with the Sipolilo campaign. And morale really plummeted. And people in London, people were asking, where is the head office? Is it in London? Is it in Lusaka? Is it in Dar es Salaam? It was against that background that this Morogoro conference was called. And it took a lot of thinking, good thinking, forward thinking by Tambo, who said, listen, let's call everybody in. to represent the areas from which they come, or the units from which they to which they belong, and let's have this conference. And MK was represented at the Morogoro conference. Yours truly attended the conference, as did a few other comrades. So, but the issue is at Morogoro, around that time, there was a number of people who resisted the idea of white people being allowed into the leadership of the organization. Now, if you ask me, if you allow Indians, what we call coloreds, white people, to come and join MK and put their lives, you know, at risk, and some were killed, by the way, but feel that because they are coloreds or Indians or white, they may not be in leadership positions in the ANC, then you're really, really not thinking right. Let's just face it. What is this inferiority complex? If you are very comfortable that what you're doing is right, why do you fear that the entrance of a few white people and others is going to change your cause? This is what I think when we were having a discussion the other day, I was saying, must this mean we must blame our mothers because they have born us inferior? As soon as other people come in, they are going to completely sway us and we will follow them. What is so mighty about them that they would be able to change the cause of what we're doing? So that group of people, as I said a little earlier, ended up being called the Gang of Eight because there were 8 people involved in this. It took time, by the way, for them to be removed from the organization because, again, Tambo was the kind of person who really believed that persuasion helps. That was his first choice in resolving a problem. It was only when these people started activities that were very, very prejudicial to the pursuit of the struggle that a decision was taken to remove them from the organization. But with that, really, I cannot say, in answer to your question, that you still remained with people who had any discomfort, certainly not the ANC that I belonged to at the time. But people like Joe Slobo were highly respected, more respected than some of our top Black leaders, because the simplicity of their lives, the clarity of their thinking, just said, this person is a revolutionary who happened to have a white skin. And I give credit to the ANC for having the confidence to work with people who are willing to participate in the freedom of South Africa, regardless of what they look like.
Tambo legacy and its relevance. So one of the things that we notice is when we look across the African continent, there is a tendency of to witness liberation movements turn into instruments of dictatorships. And in many of our countries, the same movements that ushered in independence and liberation turned into dictatorial movements. And Tambo, as you've said so religiously, was a Democrat. So what do you think in terms of the liberation theory perhaps led to this, and what distinguished Tambo perhaps from his contemporaries to even in the constitution that was being developed in the 1980s to think of a multi-party democracy as opposed to a one-party state?
South Africa was always a complex, multi-lingual, multi-racial, if you will, country. We just were never going to have a situation like in most of the rest of Africa where UNIP in Zambia, United National Independence Party of Zambia, or ZANU-PF, or ZAPU, and other parties, where you have an organization that would have more than 80% support of the population. The diversity of the population here, the was such that you were always going to have parties representing other interests. So that had to be grasped. It was part of our history, it was part of our experience, and you did not want to create them, but you had to take into account the fact that they existed and opt for a constitution that made room for multi-partyism. The majority party would always, regardless of which one it was, would always, our constitution, be in a position to run government. If we were to do coalitions, I think what we would have done is to look at who had similar ideas and form coalitions with them. But so that was the situation in South Africa. Multi-racial background, a strong presence of, if you will, white people, established over many centuries. You know, in Africa, the white population only gets there in the 19th century when they were here in the 16th or 17th century. So that was the dynamic that was that we had to deal with in the context of South Africa. But your question is, how do we end up, like many people in many countries in Africa, with a situation where the cohesiveness that Tambo managed to instill, to marshal, he was able to bring about. We've lost it now. We're talking about present day South Africa, and I think very quickly the reason we are where we are is, to a very large extent, there are very many, but maybe 2, 3 main ones. While the ANC prepared itself ideologically, intellectually, to govern this country, I think they just underestimated the role of resources in order to be able to do it. You know, Mandela was the darling of everybody on earth in terms of big presidents. You know, Clinton was here in his difficult times in America. Mandela said, "This is a president; he must be treated with respect." Bush, who was conservative, you know, coming from the Republican Party, Mandela had the respect. I wish, and this is wisdom comes with hindsight, maybe you would say, that we had at that point decided to set up an endowment fund and collect money from those who would know that this is a fund that is going to finance a new ANC that is coming from the bush, that's really coming from absolutely no economic background, but to finance it to start managing the governance in South Africa without the constraint of needing money. An endowment fund could have collected money, $1 billion easily. Mandela would have been able to command any amount of money. And it would have been very clear that what the purpose of this thing was. And then you would need to give that to fund managers and keep the ANC membership leadership away from having to manage their monies or having to scrounge too much for money. We didn't have that money, and we soon found ourselves kind of relying now, well, very much relying on donations, sponsorships by the private sector. You're coming to deal with people who were a part and parcel of the apartheid regime. Yes, now they've told you that they are democratic. What is going to be the cost of their money in terms of the policies? These are the things that started to erode the ANC. The BE thing really became a tragic disaster, while it was very good to ensure that Black people also came into the middle class, got involved in businesses. Otherwise, the government would have been running a country for white businessmen. That was good. Again, it got really very seriously derailed when people would say, okay, give me a contract, I will donate to this wonderful organization of ours, the ANC, and so on. That's how entrepreneurs were created and so on. The money was an issue. And you talk about Tambo as an ethical person. You know, Tambo used to say, and I like repeating this, the purpose of our struggle, comrades, is to liberate the country, is to defeat the apartheid regime and replace it with a democratic and ethical system of government. And he would always stress ethical. So we have achieved democracy. Every 5 years, there are elections. The ethical component is gone. When ANC people do funny things, they say, I've not been found guilty in a court of law. An ethical person will say, hey, I've harmed the image, I've tarnished the image of my organization, so let me move aside. I mean, I don't want the ANC to be associated with a person who steals money, who is known to be corrupt and so on. So we've got plenty of that now, and too many of them moved in, and I think it's proving to be quite difficult to get rid of that. That's part of our demise. The economy has been very difficult even before COVID, and it was difficult not so much because of the world economic situation, because that always infects the economies of individual countries. But in the case of the 2010, after the crash of the banks, the countries like South Africa, Brazil, India, and so on, middle income countries, were rising. South Africa was struggling to do that. Corruption was playing its role. You had the situation in which the lack of focus resulted in us inheriting an unequal inequality in the country. But we have since exacerbated that. People in 2014, poverty levels were at something like, believe it or not, 52 point something percent. People formally recognized as poor in 2014. 2017, when the last census was taken, 55.3. So there is something that the people who were driving the political economy were not doing right at all. I'm not saying it only started now, but there's something that went wrong with the manner in which this was structured. Now, I can't say if Tambo was here, there would be no corruption. I doubt very much that we would be having, it's a hypothetical situation though, but there is no way in which you would have seen so many unworthy people who really had no revolution in their bones, in their flesh, rising to the top and ending us putting the country in the situation in which it is. Dispense with integrity. It doesn't matter what generation you're in. He was a person of supreme integrity. He was trustworthy. You could trust his word. If things were difficult, he was not going to claim victory. He would just say, this is tough, we can't do it. So honesty was really a hallmark of his. I can't talk too much about his intelligence because this was just a born gift. The man happened to have been born extremely intelligent. You can't, I can't become intelligent like him, for instance, and so on. But I can be honest, I can have integrity. But I think humility. You talked a little earlier also about the gender issues. The ANC is ahead of everybody among political parties in terms of gender parity. Yes. Thanks to OR. He absolutely was adamant. And that was practiced in exile already. There are ladies who may not have come from a strong background in terms of historical participation in the struggle. She said they must be in the national executive, and they were in there, and they, acquitted themselves very well. He was very, very sensitive about that. Tambo, and some of the young people may not like this, believed very much in individual rights. You know, the Constitution has a Bill of Rights, which just makes it impossible for anybody to do anything against Mike, but similarly also against Pidjube, because they have rights as individuals. Now, when we talk about the land issue, people would like to circumscribe those rights because generally white people took black land. And so if you happen to be white, you should be willing to surrender that land. I don't know to which black person, but really for me, the virtues of Oliver Tambo was that he was a consensus leader. He was a person who was extremely democratic in his principles. He was, as I've said already, I'm trying to summarize now, he had a lot of integrity. You could just trust him, you know, morally, I mean, the men could not be associated with ambushing women or doing things that are untoward. It was really, the quotation that you read from, was it Reverend Father Canon Collins,
Yes.
was it him? Yes.
Yes.
I mean, he was saying probably Tambo ethically was driven by something beyond politics. He had a moral fiber, perhaps religious, I don't know, but he valued ethics very, very highly. He would just not do an unethical thing, if he could help it, yeah. Phased out, I want to say in respect to my hero, because I think it has relevance here. I don't know how you manage our conversation. Number one, personally, when things are tough, I say, I wonder how OR Tambo would have handled this. It wouldn't matter whether I'm managing people at Home Affairs, how would Tambo have dealt with this? That's the kind of person I think of. And I would say to the guys, you know, he's the type of person you would do a job that he assigned you. You would do it not because you feared that if you didn't do it, you would be penalized or something. You just did not want to disappoint him. You had to do it. He will be so disappointed that I've not been able to do this. Let me do it. That's the kind of thing, no fear, but the sheer respect, the sheer refusal to disappoint a person who puts so much trust in your ability to do certain things. So that's really some of the things about Oliver Tambo that I think if anybody were able to have that, it would be helpful. But for young people, again, Tambo, let's be very careful about our discussions around you. The ANC talks about intergenerational, leadership. That Mike is younger than me, I mean, puts you in a particular position. But if you're going to have a Mike who will be as corruptible as the young people who have seen, who are being corrupted by the Guptas, stealing here and so on, what is there? So in other words, you really have to, you have to have young people. I mean, somebody wanted me to become president today. I would refuse. It's easy to say because no one would want me to do that. But I would, if I could rule, I would say, I think, guys, let's start looking at whether we should actually be encouraging people over 60 years of age to take leadership. Maybe there is a lot of wisdom they can provide to those who are leading. But the world is becoming technologically so advanced that I don't quite know how to do a webinar without thinking you connect it and so on. And this is the reality of modern times. And I think you can you can advise at our age if you have anything to give based on experience. There's just a number of little tidbits where don't adulate youth needlessly. Recognize them. They clearly are more forward looking than us who are really trying to survive now. But you must ground people in principles. And that's the key ingredient in your work.
The ANC must continue to make sure that our revolutionary struggle is revolutionary in every respect and obeys the rules of any revolution, follows definite defined rules. A revolutionary behaves in a certain kind of way and is distinguished and distinguishable from the criminal, from the vigilante, from the enemy agent.